Long before Egypt became a kingdom, the land itself was changing. Around 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, northern Africa was nothing like the endless desert. Familiar today, seasonal rains swept across the region, filling vast lakes and rivers that stretched across what is now the Sahara. Grasslands covered the landscape, supporting elephants, giraffes, buffalo, gazelles, and countless other animals. Crocodiles and hippos swam through waterways that have long since vanished, while groups of hunter-gatherers followed migrating herds across an environment rich with life. Fragments of their world still survive. Scattered throughout the modern Sahara are thousands of rock paintings carved into cliffs and cave walls. They depict cattle grazing beneath trees, hunters pursuing wild game, and even people swimming in places now buried beneath dunes. To archaeologists, these images are windows into a forgotten Africa. A reminder that one of the harshest deserts on Earth was once a thriving ecosystem. But climates are never permanent. Over thousands of years, subtle shifts in Earth's orbit gradually altered the pattern of seasonal rains. The monsoons that had nourished the Sahara began retreating southward. Lakes shrank, rivers dried up, grasslands gave way to scrub, then sand. Generation after generation watched the land become less forgiving, until surviving in the open Sahara became increasingly difficult. Faced with an expanding desert, people moved toward the one place where water remained dependable: the Nile. Flowing more than 4,000 miles from the highlands of East Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile was unlike any other river in the ancient world. Every summer, heavy rains falling hundreds of miles to the south caused the river to swell. Weeks later, those floodwaters reached Egypt, spilling over the riverbanks and spreading across the surrounding plains. When the waters finally retreated, they left behind a fresh layer of dark, fertile silt rich in nutrients. To the people who settled there, this annual cycle must have seemed almost miraculous. While neighboring regions often depended on unpredictable rainfall, the Nile delivered water with remarkable regularity. Year after year, it renewed the soil naturally, allowing crops to flourish without exhausting the land. Wheat and barley grew in abundance. Flax provided fibers for clothing and rope. Date palms offered fruit and shade, while papyrus flourished in marshes, supplying the raw material for boats, baskets, mats, and eventually one of history's earliest writing surfaces. The river became far more than a source of food. It was Egypt's highway. Traveling across the surrounding deserts was slow and dangerous, but the Nile connected communities from the first cataract in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north. Boats carried people, livestock, grain, stone, timber, and ideas between settlements that would otherwise have remained isolated. Even the prevailing winds seemed perfectly suited to this natural transportation system. Sailboats could ride the current northward while using the steady southern winds to return upstream, creating an efficient route in both directions. Few civilizations have ever depended so completely on a single geographical feature. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously described Egypt as the gift of the Nile. Although written more than 2,000 years after Egypt first emerged, the phrase captured an essential truth. Without the river, there would have been no fertile farmland, no great cities, and no pharaohs. Beyond its narrow green valley lay deserts that formed natural barriers against invasion, but offered little opportunity for agriculture. Nearly every village, temple, and royal capital would eventually rise within sight of the Nile's waters. As more people gathered along its banks, their lives began to change in profound ways. Instead of constantly moving in search of food, communities settled permanently. They cleared fields, dug irrigation channels, and domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats. Houses built from mud brick clustered into villages, while families learned to store grain against years when the flood proved less generous. Population slowly increased, and with it came specialization. Some people farmed, others crafted pottery, shaped stone tools, or traded valuable resources over increasingly long distances. Archaeological discoveries reveal that these early communities were far from isolated. Even before the first pharaoh, networks of exchange stretched across northeastern Africa and the Near East. Obsidian from Ethiopia, cedar from the Levant, gold from Nubia, and exotic shells from distant coasts found their way into Egyptian settlements, suggesting that ideas and technologies traveled alongside valuable goods. Among the most important changes was the growing importance of leadership. Managing irrigation required cooperation. Harvests had to be organized. Surplus grain needed protection and distribution. Disputes over land and water demanded resolution. Over time, influential families emerged within many villages, gradually accumulating wealth, authority, and religious prestige. Some communities became larger and more powerful than others, absorbing their neighbors or forming alliances that extended across the valley. By around 4000 BC, Egypt was no longer a collection of scattered farming villages. Regional cultures had begun taking shape along different stretches of the Nile. In the south, communities developed distinctive pottery, burial customs, and artistic traditions centered around what historians now call Upper Egypt, a region that, despite its name, lay farther upstream. To the north, in the broad Nile Delta, where the river split into many branches before reaching the Mediterranean, the people of Lower Egypt followed their own paths of development. The two regions shared the same river, but they were not yet one country. Each had its own powerful settlements, local rulers, religious traditions, and competing ambitions. As populations continued to grow, so too did rivalry. Wealth brought influence, and influence invited conflict. Control of trade routes, fertile farmland, and strategic stretches of the Nile became increasingly valuable. Small chiefdoms expanded into larger territories, and larger territories began to resemble the first kingdoms. The foundations of Egyptian civilization had been laid, but the age of villages was drawing to a close. Somewhere in the centuries ahead, one ruler would succeed where countless others had failed. Through conquest, diplomacy, or perhaps a combination of both, he would unite the lands of the Nile under a single crown and give birth to one of the world's first great states. His name, according to most historians, was Narmer. By the late 4th millennium BC, the Nile Valley had become a patchwork of competing kingdoms. The small farming villages that had once dotted the riverbanks had grown into powerful regional centers, each ruled by local elites who controlled land, trade, and religious ceremonies. Wealth flowed through the Nile in the form of grain, livestock, precious stones, and imported goods from distant lands. The rulers who commanded these resources built larger tombs, employed skilled craftsmen, and surrounded themselves with symbols of authority. What had begun as scattered communities was rapidly evolving into organized states. Among the most powerful were the kingdoms of Upper Egypt. Centered around cities such as Nekhen, also known as Hierakonpolis, and Abydos, these southern rulers competed fiercely for dominance. Archaeological excavations have uncovered elaborate graves filled with finely crafted pottery, ivory carvings, ceremonial weapons, and imported luxury goods, evidence that political power and social inequality were becoming deeply established. These leaders were no longer simply village chiefs. They were kings in all but name. Gradually, one kingdom began absorbing the others, whether through military conquest, political alliances, or strategic marriages remains uncertain. The archaeological record tells only fragments of the story, leaving historians to piece together events from broken inscriptions, royal tombs, and ceremonial objects. What is clear is that by around 3100 BC, one ruler emerged above all rivals. His name was Narmer. Few figures stand at such a decisive turning point in history. Before Narmer, there were many kingdoms along the Nile. After him, there was Egypt. The strongest evidence for his reign comes from one of the most famous artifacts ever discovered, the Narmer palette. Carved from a slab of dark green siltstone and standing over 2 feet tall, it was likely created as a ceremonial object rather than a practical one. On one side, Narmer is shown wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt while raising a mace over a defeated enemy. On the reverse, he wears the flat red crown of Lower Egypt. Together, the two crowns symbolize something entirely new: a ruler who claimed authority over both lands. Modern historians debate whether the palette records a single historical victory or serves as symbolic royal propaganda. Ancient rulers often blended real events with powerful imagery meant to emphasize divine authority. Regardless of its exact meaning, the message is unmistakable. Egypt was united under one king. That achievement transformed the course of history. Instead of competing regional rulers, the Nile Valley now possessed a centralized government capable of directing labor, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and organizing massive construction projects. Grain could be gathered from farms hundreds of miles apart and redistributed wherever it was needed. Trade became more secure. Local officials answered to a single royal administration rather than dozens of competing kings. The position Narmer created would become one of the most enduring institutions in human history. The Egyptians did not originally use the word pharaoh for their rulers. That title, meaning great house, would become common much later. In Narmer's time, the king was simply the ruler of the two lands, a living intermediary between humanity and the gods. Maintaining order was not merely a political duty, it was a sacred obligation. Central to this belief was the concept of Ma'at. More than a goddess, Ma'at represented truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order itself. Egyptians believed the universe functioned according to this delicate harmony. The annual flooding of the Nile, the rising of the sun, successful harvests, and the stability of society all depended upon it. Chaos, known as Isfet, was its opposite: disorder, violence, famine, and destruction. The king's greatest responsibility was ensuring that Ma'at prevailed. Every military campaign, religious ceremony, legal judgment, and public work reinforced the idea that the ruler protected Egypt from chaos. This belief gave extraordinary legitimacy to royal authority. The king was not simply governing people, he was preserving the balance of the universe itself. To manage this growing kingdom, Egypt developed one of the world's earliest bureaucracies. Officials oversaw agriculture, taxation, construction, and trade. Scribes carefully recorded harvests, livestock, and supplies. Although the exact origins of Egyptian writing remain debated, by the time of the First Dynasty, a recognizable hieroglyphic system had emerged. These elegant symbols adorned monuments and ceremonial objects, while simpler script allowed administrators to keep increasingly detailed records. Writing changed everything. For the first time, royal decrees could be preserved. Tax collections could be tracked. Religious rituals could be standardized across the kingdom. The memory of the state no longer depended solely upon oral tradition. Narmer also established traditions that would endure for nearly 3,000 years. Future kings adopted the double crown, representing Upper and Lower Egypt. Royal names were enclosed within symbolic frames. Ceremonial processions, religious festivals, and elaborate court rituals reinforced the unity of the kingdom. Even the idea that Egypt consisted of the two lands remained central to royal identity throughout its history. The first dynasties spent decades strengthening this new state. Royal cemeteries at Abydos grew larger and more sophisticated. Kings commissioned increasingly elaborate tombs built from mud brick, surrounded by storage chambers filled with food, tools, furniture, jewelry, and offerings intended to sustain them in the afterlife. Some early rulers were even buried alongside servants who appear to have been sacrificed, a grim practice that disappeared after the first dynasty as symbolic substitutes became more common. Meanwhile, Egypt's influence expanded beyond its borders. Trade routes reached deeper into Nubia to the south in search of gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. Expeditions traveled into the Sinai Peninsula for copper and turquoise. Contact with the cities of the Levant brought timber and luxury goods unavailable along the Nile. Protected by deserts on either side and united under a powerful monarchy, Egypt entered a period of remarkable stability. Yet the ambitions of its kings continued to grow. As royal authority strengthened, so did the desire to express that power in ways the world had never seen before. Simple mud brick tombs gradually became larger and more elaborate. Skilled architects experimented with new designs. Stone, once used sparingly, began replacing brick in royal monuments. Each generation sought to leave behind something greater than the last. Within only a few centuries of Narmer's unification, one visionary king and his brilliant architect would begin a project so extraordinary that it would forever change the skyline of Egypt and the history of architecture itself. The age of the pyramids was about to begin. By the beginning of the Third Dynasty, Egypt had become one of the most stable and organized kingdoms on earth. Nearly 5 centuries had passed since Narmer united the two lands. Along the Nile, harvests continued to sustain a growing population. Officials managed an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy, and generations of kings reinforced the idea that Egypt's prosperity depended upon the divine authority of the crown. The kingdom had known conflict and succession disputes, but compared to much of the ancient world, it enjoyed an extraordinary degree of continuity. That stability gave Egypt something few civilizations possessed: time. The annual flood brought food. Food supported workers. Workers built monuments. Those monuments, in turn, strengthened the prestige of the king, whose rule ensured that the gods continued to bless Egypt with order and abundance. It was a cycle that fed itself, allowing each generation to dream on a larger scale than the one before. Then, around 2670 BC, a king named Djoser took the throne. On the surface, there was little reason to believe his reign would differ dramatically from those before it. Kings had always built elaborate tombs to prepare for eternity. Traditionally, these tombs were rectangular mud brick structures known as mastabas, surrounded by underground burial chambers, stocked with everything a ruler might need in the afterlife. But Djoser had an advisor unlike any Egypt had ever seen. His name was Imhotep. To later generations, Imhotep became a figure of almost mythical brilliance. He was a royal official, architect, engineer, physician, high priest, and scholar. Centuries after his death, Egyptians would worship him as a god of wisdom and healing, while the Greeks identified him with Asclepius, their own god of medicine. Although much of his life remains mysterious, one achievement secured his place in history forever. He conceived the world's first pyramid. Rather than building a single mastaba, Imhotep stacked progressively smaller mastabas atop one another, creating a 6-tiered structure that rose nearly 200 feet above the desert at Saqqara. More revolutionary still was the material itself. Instead of relying primarily on sun-dried mud brick, the complex was built from carefully cut limestone. It was humanity's first monumental stone building. The step pyramid dominated the surrounding landscape in a way no tomb ever had. To anyone approaching across the Nile Valley, it seemed almost impossible. A mountain shaped by human hands. Around it stretched an enormous ceremonial complex enclosed by towering walls, complete with courtyards, temples, shrines, and ceremonial gateways. Many designed not for the living, but to allow Djoser's spirit to continue ruling for eternity. The project changed Egyptian architecture forever. If stone could be used to build something this immense, what else was possible? The answer arrived with the kings of the Fourth Dynasty. Among them was Sneferu, perhaps the greatest builder Egypt ever produced. Unlike some rulers remembered for a single monument or military campaign, Sneferu's legacy was one of relentless experimentation. During his reign, architects pushed the limits of engineering, learning through both success and failure. His first major attempt, now known as the Maidum Pyramid, likely began as another step pyramid before being transformed into a smooth-sided structure. At some point, perhaps during construction or shortly afterward, much of its outer casing collapsed, leaving behind the strange tower-like ruin that still stands today. Undeterred, Sneferu ordered another pyramid at Dashur. Partway through construction, builders realized the steep angle threatened the monument's stability. Rather than abandoning it, they reduced the slope near the top, giving the structure its distinctive appearance. Today, it is known as the Bent Pyramid, a permanent reminder that even the greatest architects learned through trial and error. Only then did they achieve perfection. Sneferu's third great project, the Red Pyramid, became Egypt's first true smooth-sided pyramid, completed exactly as intended. Rising from the desert with clean, symmetrical lines, it represented the culmination of decades of innovation. The techniques developed there would make possible the most famous monument in human history. That task fell to Sneferu's son, Khufu. Very little is known about the man himself. Unlike later pharaohs, Khufu left behind few surviving inscriptions describing his reign. Ancient Greek writers, composing their histories more than 2,000 years later, portrayed him as a harsh and tyrannical ruler. But modern historians treat those accounts with caution. Contemporary Egyptian evidence paints a far more limited picture. The greatest testimony to his reign is not written in words. It is carved into the landscape. Around 2580 BC, work began on the Great Pyramid at Giza. Even today, its scale is difficult to comprehend. Originally standing about 481 feet tall, it remained the tallest structure built by human beings for nearly 4,000 years. More than 2 million limestone blocks, many weighing several tons, were transported, positioned, and fitted together with astonishing precision. The base is level to within a matter of centimeters, and the four sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. For centuries, people struggled to explain how such a monument could have been built. Some imagined armies of enslaved workers driven by cruel overseers. Others proposed lost civilizations, or even impossible supernatural explanations. Modern archaeology tells a different story. Excavations near Giza have uncovered the remains of planned workers' villages, bakeries, breweries, barracks, and cemeteries belonging to the laborers themselves. Graffiti left inside the pyramid by construction crews includes names such as the Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting pride rather than oppression. Many of the workers appear to have been skilled craftsmen and seasonal laborers, farmers who could work on royal projects during the months when the Nile floods covered their fields and agriculture temporarily paused. The pyramids were still an immense national undertaking. Tens of thousands of people quarried stone, hauled supplies, prepared food, crafted tools, managed logistics, and organized transportation along the Nile. Their work demanded remarkable coordination from Egypt's bureaucracy, demonstrating just how sophisticated the kingdom had become only a few centuries after its unification. Khufu's successors continued the tradition. His son Khafra built the second Great Pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller but constructed on higher ground, giving it an equally commanding presence. Most scholars also attribute the Great Sphinx, a colossal limestone guardian with the body of a lion and the face of a king, to Khafra's reign, though debate continues over its exact origins. Nearby, Menkaure completed the third and smallest of Giza's Great Pyramids, finishing the royal necropolis that still defines Egypt in the modern imagination. Yet while kings pursued immortality in stone, ordinary Egyptians lived lives that looked very different. Most people never saw the inside of a palace. They rose with the sun, tended fields of wheat and barley, repaired irrigation canals, cared for livestock, and relied on the predictable rhythm of the Nile. Homes were built from mud brick, keeping interiors cool against the desert heat. Bread and beer formed the staples of nearly every meal, supplemented by onions, fish, dates, figs, and vegetables grown along the fertile floodplain. Religion touched every aspect of daily life. The gods were not distant beings, but active participants in the world around them. The sun rose because Ra crossed the heavens. The Nile flooded through divine order. The dead continued their journey into the afterlife if the proper rituals were observed. Every temple, festival, offering, and prayer reinforced the belief that Egypt prospered only so long as Ma'at, the balance established by the gods, was maintained. For generations, it seemed that balance would last forever. The pyramids stood as proof that Egypt's kings commanded resources unmatched anywhere on earth. Their authority appeared absolute. Their monuments seemed eternal. But beneath the appearance of unshakable stability, subtle cracks were beginning to form. A kingdom built on divine kingship depended upon strong rulers, prosperous harvests, and a bureaucracy capable of holding everything together. Eventually, all three would begin to fail. For nearly 500 years, the Old Kingdom had appeared unbreakable. Generation after generation, pharaohs ruled from Memphis, while officials carried out the business of government across the length of the Nile. The pyramids rose higher, royal tombs grew more elaborate, and Egypt seemed to embody permanence itself. To those living at the height of the Old Kingdom, it may have seemed that the age of the pyramid builders would continue forever. History, however, rarely follows a straight path. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the foundations that had supported Egypt for centuries were beginning to weaken. The change was gradual, almost invisible at first, but like the slow erosion of stone, its effects accumulated over generations. One of the central figures in this story was a king named Pepi II. According to later historical records, Pepi II may have come to the throne as a young child and ruled for more than 90 years, making his reign one of the longest ever attributed to a monarch. Although the exact length remains debated by modern historians, there is little doubt that his rule lasted for decades. At first, that extraordinary longevity may have seemed like a blessing. Instead, it created uncertainty. A king who outlives nearly everyone around him eventually exhausts an entire generation of experienced officials. Powerful governors establish their own families, their own alliances, and their own ambitions. By the final years of Pepi's reign, many of Egypt's provincial rulers, known as nomarchs, had become increasingly independent. These governors had originally served as representatives of the pharaoh. Now, many behaved like rulers in their own right. Across Egypt, local elites built increasingly elaborate tombs, celebrating not the achievements of the king, but their own wealth and authority. Inscriptions praised provincial governors for feeding their communities during difficult years, settling disputes, and maintaining order, roles that had once belonged primarily to the central government. Power was quietly shifting away from the throne. Then, nature dealt Egypt another blow. Everything depended on the Nile. Each summer, floodwaters carried fertile silt across the floodplain, renewing the soil and ensuring abundant harvests. But the Nile's annual inundation was never guaranteed. Around the end of the Old Kingdom, evidence from climate records suggests that a series of weaker floods coincided with a broader period of environmental instability affecting much of the ancient Near East. Without sufficient flooding, harvests declined, grain stores shrank, food became scarce. For ordinary Egyptians, the consequences were immediate. Fields that should have produced abundant crops yielded far less. Livestock suffered. Families struggled to feed themselves. As famine spread through parts of the country, confidence in the king began to erode. This struck at the heart of Egyptian society. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader. He was the guardian of Ma'at, the divine order that kept the universe in balance. If the Nile failed, if famine spread, if chaos replaced stability, many people naturally questioned whether the gods still favored their ruler. As central authority weakened, regional rivalries intensified. Provincial governors competed for resources. Local loyalties replaced national unity. Communication between distant regions became more difficult, and the bureaucracy that had once coordinated one of the world's most efficient states struggled to function. Eventually, the Old Kingdom collapsed, not in a single dramatic event, but through the slow unraveling of the institutions that had sustained it. Historians refer to the centuries that followed as the First Intermediate Period. For a long time, this era was described as an age of complete chaos, a dark age filled with violence, famine, and the collapse of civilization. Much of that image came from texts written by later Egyptians, who looked back on the period as a warning about what happened when Ma'at gave way to disorder. Modern archaeology paints a more complicated picture. There was undoubtedly political fragmentation. Instead of one king ruling all Egypt, multiple rival dynasties claimed legitimacy. The cities of Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt emerged as competing centers of power, each governed by its own royal line. Yet life did not simply stop. Farmers continued cultivating their fields. Craftsmen continued producing pottery and tools. Local governments adapted to changing circumstances, and in many regions, everyday life appears to have continued with surprising resilience. Some provincial communities may even have prospered as local leaders gained greater autonomy. The collapse of central authority also brought unexpected cultural changes. During the Old Kingdom, elaborate funerary texts and rituals had been reserved almost exclusively for the king. But as royal power diminished, ideas about the afterlife became increasingly accessible to ordinary elites. Coffin inscriptions that once echoed royal beliefs began appearing in the burials of wealthy officials, reflecting a gradual shift in Egyptian religion. Power had fractured, but Egyptian civilization endured. The language, religious traditions, artistic styles, and administrative practices that had developed over centuries did not disappear. They survived within competing kingdoms, waiting for another leader capable of restoring unity. That leader would emerge from the south. In the city of Thebes, a dynasty of ambitious rulers steadily expanded its influence, defeating rivals and reclaiming territory along the Nile. Among them was a king whose victories would reunite Egypt for the first time in generations. His name was Mentuhotep II. The age of the pyramids had ended, but Egypt's story was far from over. From the ruins of the Old Kingdom, a new era would rise, one shaped not only by powerful kings, but by literature, trade, diplomacy, and a renewed confidence that the two lands could once again become one. For more than a century, Egypt had been divided. The old certainty of the Pyramid Age had vanished. Rival kings ruled from different capitals. Provincial governors defended their own territories. And the unity that Narmer had forged so many centuries earlier seemed like a distant memory. Yet despite the political fragmentation, Egypt itself had not disappeared. The Nile still flooded. Farmers still planted their crops. Temples remained active, and the traditions that defined Egyptian civilization endured. The kingdom was wounded, but it was still alive. Its revival began in the south. Thebes, a city that had once been little more than a provincial center, steadily grew in importance during the First Intermediate Period. Its rulers expanded their influence along the Nile, bringing neighboring territories under their control, while presenting themselves as the rightful heirs to the ancient kings. For years, they fought a slow struggle against the rival dynasty based at Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt. Eventually, one king gained the upper hand. His name was Mentuhotep II. Around 2055 BC, after decades of conflict, Mentuhotep defeated his northern rivals and reunited Egypt beneath a single crown. Like Narmer before him, he accomplished something that reshaped the course of Egyptian history. The fractured kingdom became one once more. But the new Egypt was not simply a restoration of the old one. The collapse of the Old Kingdom had taught painful lessons about the dangers of concentrating too much power in local governors. Mentuhotep and the kings who followed worked to strengthen the central government, while keeping a closer watch on provincial officials. The monarchy remained the heart of the state, but its administration became more sophisticated, with officials appointed and supervised more carefully than before. Historians call this new era the Middle Kingdom. To later generations of Egyptians, it represented something close to a golden age. The rulers of the 12th dynasty, particularly Amenemhat I and his son Senusret I, built upon the stability that Mentuhotep had restored. They moved the royal residence farther north to better oversee both Upper and Lower Egypt, while launching ambitious construction projects throughout the kingdom. Temples rose along the Nile, irrigation systems were expanded, and agricultural production increased once again. The Nile remained Egypt's lifeblood, but its waters were managed more effectively than ever. Engineers improved canals and irrigation networks, helping farmers make better use of the fertile floodplain. Larger harvests meant larger surpluses, and those surpluses supported growing towns, skilled craftsmen, and an increasingly complex government. Trade flourished alongside agriculture. Egyptian expeditions ventured deep into Nubia, where rich deposits of gold helped fill the royal treasury. Fortresses built along the Nile secured these southern territories while protecting valuable trade routes. To the east, merchants crossed the Sinai Peninsula in search of copper and turquoise. Ships sailed into the Red Sea and beyond, while caravans connected Egypt with the cities of the Levant. One expedition became legendary, even in antiquity. The Egyptians called the destination Punt. Its exact location remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries, though most scholars place it somewhere along the Horn of Africa. Egyptian ships returned carrying incense, ebony, ivory, exotic animals, leopard skins, and living myrrh trees, whose fragrant resin was prized in temple rituals. These voyages demonstrated just how far Egypt's influence and commercial networks now extended. The Middle Kingdom also witnessed something less visible than pyramids or temples, but no less remarkable. It became an age of literature. For the first time, Egyptian writers produced works intended not merely to record taxes or commemorate kings, but to entertain, instruct, and reflect upon the human condition. Stories, poems, wisdom texts, and philosophical dialogues circulated among the educated elite, revealing a civilization increasingly interested in questions of morality, justice, and personal responsibility. Among the most famous is the Tale of Senuhe. The story follows an Egyptian court official who flees the country after the death of his king, spending years among foreign peoples before finally returning home in old age. Though filled with adventure, its emotional core is surprisingly modern. It explores loyalty, identity, exile, and the longing to return to one's homeland. Even after 4,000 years, its themes remain recognizable. Other texts offered practical advice for navigating life. Instructions written by experienced officials taught young scribes how to behave with humility, respect authority, and avoid arrogance. These works reflected the growing importance of Egypt's educated bureaucracy. While the pharaoh remained the symbolic center of the kingdom, it was thousands of literate administrators who kept the machinery of government running. Becoming a scribe was one of the most respected careers in Egypt. Unlike farmers, who labored beneath the scorching sun, or quarry workers, who carved stone from desert cliffs, scribes worked indoors with reed pens and rolls of papyrus. They recorded harvests, drafted legal documents, organized military supplies, and maintained the vast archives of the state. Literacy remained rare, making scribes members of an influential and privileged class. Religion also continued to evolve. The god Osiris, long associated with death and rebirth, became increasingly central to Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. Earlier generations had viewed eternal life as a privilege reserved largely for kings. But during the Middle Kingdom, the hope of resurrection became more widely available to ordinary people who could afford the proper funerary rites. Death was no longer seen as the exclusive journey of pharaohs. It became a destination that many Egyptians believed they too could reach through righteous living and careful preparation. For nearly 2 centuries, the Middle Kingdom enjoyed remarkable prosperity. Its borders were secure. Its economy was strong. Its rulers commanded respect from neighboring lands, while Egyptian culture reached new heights in art, literature, and administration. Looking back, it seemed that the painful lessons of the Old Kingdom had finally been learned. But beyond Egypt's northeastern frontier, another change was unfolding. Groups of people from Western Asia had been crossing into the eastern Nile Delta for generations. Some arrived as merchants. Others came seeking farmland or employment. They settled peacefully among the local population, bringing with them new customs, technologies, and languages. At first, they posed little threat. Yet, as the authority of Egypt's later Middle Kingdom kings gradually weakened, these foreign communities became more powerful. Over time, one of their leaders would seize control of northern Egypt, introducing military innovations that the Egyptians had never before encountered. For the first time in its history, the 2 lands would be ruled by foreign kings. For centuries, Egypt had looked inward, protected by deserts to the east and west, cataracts to the south, and the Mediterranean Sea to the north. The kingdom often seemed insulated from the upheavals that shaped the wider ancient world. Foreign merchants and travelers certainly entered Egypt, but the Nile Valley remained, for the most part, under Egyptian control. That illusion of security began to fade near the end of the Middle Kingdom. As royal authority weakened once again, the government found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over the eastern Nile Delta. Communities of immigrants from Western Asia, many of whose families had lived in Egypt for generations, grew larger and more influential. They traded with local Egyptians, worked as craftsmen and farmers, and gradually established their own centers of power. Then, around the 17th century BC, those communities took control. The Egyptians called them the Hyksos. For many years, the name was translated as Shepherd Kings, but modern scholarship has shown that it more accurately means rulers of foreign lands. They were not a single invading army sweeping across Egypt in one dramatic campaign, as later Egyptian traditions sometimes suggested. Instead, archaeological evidence indicates a more gradual process. As the authority of the native kings declined, Hyksos leaders consolidated power in the delta until they established their own dynasty. Their capital was the city of Avaris. Located in the northeastern delta, Avaris became a thriving international center where Egyptian, Levantine, and Near Eastern cultures blended together. Excavations at the site have uncovered homes, workshops, temples, imported pottery, and even Minoan-style wall paintings from the island of Crete, evidence of a city deeply connected to the wider eastern Mediterranean. For roughly a century, Egypt was divided once again. The Hyksos ruled Lower Egypt from Avaris, while native Egyptian dynasties continued governing Upper Egypt from Thebes. Unlike many later conquerors, the Hyksos did not seek to erase Egyptian culture. They adopted Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own deities, and presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs. Yet they also brought something Egypt had rarely faced before: military technology unlike anything the Egyptians possessed. Among their most important innovations was the horse-drawn chariot. Although horses had been known in parts of the Near East for centuries, they had never played a major role in Egyptian warfare. The Hyksos demonstrated how fast, lightweight chariots could transform the battlefield, allowing skilled archers to strike with speed and mobility impossible for infantry alone. They also introduced more powerful composite bows, Unlike traditional self-bows carved from a single piece of wood, composite bows combined layers of wood, horn, and sinew, producing far greater range and penetrating power. Alongside new styles of bronze weapons and improved fortifications, these technologies gave the Hyksos a significant military advantage. Ironically, their greatest legacy would not be their rule. It would be what the Egyptians learned from them. Far to the south, the rulers of Thebes never accepted Hyksos domination as permanent. Generation after generation, they strengthened their armies, adopted the very technologies introduced by their rivals, and prepared for the day they could reunify Egypt. The final struggle began under Seqenenre. Exactly how he died remained a mystery until modern science examined his mummy. CT scans revealed devastating head wounds inflicted by multiple weapons, suggesting he was either killed in battle or executed after capture. Whatever the circumstances, his injuries testify to the brutality of the conflict that engulfed Egypt. His sons continued the fight. Kamose launched aggressive campaigns against the Hyksos, pushing northward from Thebes and disrupting trade between Avaris and its allies farther south. Though he died before completing the conquest, the momentum had shifted. The decisive victory belonged to his younger brother, Ahmose. Around 1550 BC, Ahmose captured Avaris after what appears to have been a prolonged campaign. The Hyksos fled into southern Canaan, but Ahmose pursued them beyond Egypt's borders, laying siege to their remaining strongholds until their power was finally broken. For the first time in Egyptian history, a pharaoh had carried war deep into foreign territory. That experience profoundly changed Egypt's outlook. The kings of the Old and Middle Kingdoms had largely viewed Egypt as a kingdom protected by natural barriers. Ahmose reached a different conclusion. If hostile powers could establish themselves in the Delta once, they could do so again. The best defense, he believed, was to control the lands beyond Egypt's borders. This marked the beginning of the New Kingdom. If the Old Kingdom was the age of the pyramids, and the Middle Kingdom the age of literature and renewal, the New Kingdom would become the age of empire. Its rulers created a standing professional army unlike any Egypt had previously maintained. Chariot corps became a permanent feature of the military. Soldiers trained with composite bows, bronze swords, spears, and battle axes. Fortresses guarded strategic frontiers, while military commanders gained increasing influence within the royal court. The wealth generated by conquest transformed the kingdom. Campaigns into Nubia secured enormous quantities of gold, which financed ambitious building projects across Egypt. Control of trade routes brought exotic goods from Africa and Asia, while tribute flowed into royal treasuries from conquered territories. Egypt was no longer simply defending itself. It was becoming one of the dominant powers of the ancient Near East. The victory over the Hyksos also reshaped Egyptian identity. Later generations remembered the period of foreign rule as a national humiliation, even if the historical reality had been more complex. The New Kingdom pharaohs portrayed themselves as protectors of Egypt against outsiders, emphasizing military strength alongside their traditional role as guardians of Ma'at. It was a powerful message, and one that justified expansion. Within a few decades, Egypt's armies would march farther than ever before, crossing deserts and mountain passes into lands that earlier kings could scarcely have imagined ruling. Leading them would be a remarkable series of rulers, including one woman who governed as king in a world dominated by men, and a military genius whose campaigns would earn him the title of Egypt's greatest conqueror. The kingdom that had once been content to live along the Nile was about to become an empire. Ahmose had driven the Hyksos from Egypt, but victory alone did not guarantee security. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom understood that the greatest threats to Egypt no longer lay within the Nile Valley. They came from beyond its borders, from rival kingdoms in Syria and Canaan, ambitious rulers in Mesopotamia, and powerful states that competed for the trade routes linking Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Rather than waiting for those threats to reach Egypt, the new pharaohs carried the fight to them. Campaign after campaign pushed Egyptian influence farther north into the Levant and deeper south into Nubia. Fortresses guarded strategic frontiers, while conquered territories paid tribute in gold, timber, livestock, copper, and luxury goods. Never before had Egypt projected its power so far beyond the Nile. Among the rulers who shaped this new age, one stands apart not because of the wars she fought, but because of the peace she preserved. Her name was Hatshepsut. When her husband, Thutmose II, died around 1479 BC, the throne passed to his young son, Thutmose III. The boy was too young to rule alone, and Hatshepsut initially served as his regent. It might have ended there. Instead, over the next several years, she gradually assumed the full powers of kingship. This was no small matter. Egyptian women enjoyed legal rights unusual for the ancient world. They could own property, inherit wealth, conduct business, and initiate divorce. Yet the role of pharaoh had always been overwhelmingly male. To rule successfully, Hatshepsut did not present herself as a queen governing on behalf of a king. She declared herself king. Her monuments reflected that decision. Artists often depicted her wearing the royal kilt, the ceremonial false beard, and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. In inscriptions, she adopted the titles traditionally reserved for male rulers, not because she sought to erase her identity, but because the institution of kingship itself demanded a familiar image of divine authority. Remarkably, the kingdom accepted her rule. Far from plunging Egypt into crisis, Hatshepsut presided over one of the most prosperous reigns in its history. Instead of focusing primarily on conquest, she invested heavily in trade, diplomacy, and construction. Her greatest architectural achievement still rises above the cliffs of western Thebes. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, built into the face of towering limestone cliffs, its elegant terraces and colonnades seem to emerge naturally from the landscape. Even today, it is considered one of the masterpieces of ancient Egyptian architecture, blending monumental scale with remarkable harmony. Its walls tell the story Hatshepsut wanted remembered. Among the most famous scenes are those depicting an expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. Egyptian ships returned laden with ivory, ebony, incense, gold, exotic animals, and dozens of living myrrh trees, carefully transported so they could be replanted in Egyptian soil. The reliefs even portray the landscapes and rulers of Punt with extraordinary detail, providing historians with one of the ancient world's most vivid records of long-distance trade. Trade rather than war filled Egypt's treasury during much of Hatshepsut's reign. Temples expanded, monuments multiplied. Prosperity spread across the kingdom. Yet while Hatshepsut built, another king quietly prepared. For more than 20 years, Thutmose III remained in the background, officially serving as co-ruler while Hatshepsut governed. When she died around 1458 BC, he finally assumed sole control of the throne. If Hatshepsut had been one of Egypt's greatest builders, Thutmose III would become its greatest general. Almost immediately, rebellion erupted among Egypt's northern territories. Several Canaanite princes, supported by the powerful kingdom of Mitanni, believed the transition offered an opportunity to break free from Egyptian rule. They underestimated their new king. Marching north with remarkable speed, Thutmose confronted the coalition near the city of Megiddo in present-day Israel. The campaign became legendary. His generals urged caution, recommending safer roads around the surrounding mountains. Thutmose chose the most dangerous route instead, a narrow mountain pass where his army would be vulnerable if an ambush awaited them. It was an enormous gamble. Fortunately for the Egyptians, the enemy had dismissed the route as impossible for a large army. Emerging unexpectedly onto the plain before Megiddo, Thutmose caught the coalition completely by surprise. The battle ended in a decisive Egyptian victory. Although the enemy escaped behind the city's walls while Egyptian soldiers paused to plunder the abandoned camp, Megiddo eventually surrendered after a lengthy siege. The victory secured Egypt's dominance over Canaan and marked the beginning of nearly 2 decades of annual military campaigns. Year after year, Thutmose marched north. His armies crossed the Euphrates River, campaigned deep into Syria, subdued rebellious cities, and established Egyptian authority farther from the Nile than ever before. In the south, Nubia remained firmly under Egyptian control, providing enormous quantities of gold that financed the empire's growing ambitions. By the end of his reign, Egypt controlled territory stretching from the fourth cataract of the Nile in modern Sudan to parts of northern Syria. No pharaoh, before or after, would rule a larger empire. Maintaining such vast lands required more than military strength. Conquered rulers were often allowed to remain in power, so long as they acknowledged Egyptian supremacy, paid tribute, and supplied troops when required. The sons of foreign kings were frequently educated at the Egyptian court, where they learned the Egyptian language, religion, and customs before eventually returning home as loyal allies. This combination of diplomacy and force proved remarkably effective. Egypt's wealth reached extraordinary levels. Tribute poured into royal storehouses in the form of silver, lapis lazuli, cedar wood from Lebanon, horses, chariots, precious metals, and luxury goods from across the Near East. The temples of Karnak expanded into one of the largest religious complexes ever constructed, supported by gifts from victorious kings, eager to thank the gods for their success. The empire also became deeply connected to the wider international world. Clay tablets discovered at the site of Amarna centuries later reveal correspondence between Egypt and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites. These letters discuss royal marriages, diplomatic disputes, gifts of gold, requests for military assistance, and the delicate balance of power between the great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age. Egypt was no longer an isolated civilization along a river. It had become one of the superpowers of its age. Yet, with immense wealth came immense confidence. The pharaoh was celebrated not only as a victorious warrior, but as the chosen representative of the gods themselves. Temples grew richer than ever before. The priesthood accumulated vast estates and enormous influence. The old traditions that had guided Egypt for centuries appeared stronger than ever. Then, without warning, a new king would reject many of those traditions altogether. He would abandon the ancient gods, build an entirely new capital in the desert, and attempt one of the most radical religious revolutions in human history. His name was Amenhotep IV. History remembers him by another name, Akhenaten. By the middle of the 14th century BC, Egypt stood at the height of its power. Its armies dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Tribute flowed into the royal treasury from foreign kingdoms. Magnificent temples lined the Nile, while the priesthood of Amun, chief among Egypt's many gods, had grown immensely wealthy. The empire founded by Ahmose and expanded by Thutmose III seemed stronger than ever. Few could have imagined that its greatest upheaval would come not from a foreign invasion, but from the throne itself. When Amenhotep III died after one of the most prosperous reigns in Egyptian history, his son inherited a kingdom unlike any before it. The new king, Amenhotep IV, possessed vast wealth, loyal armies, and the prestige of centuries of successful rule. Within only a few years, he began dismantling the very traditions that had made that success possible. At first, the changes seemed subtle. Among Egypt's many gods was Aten, the visible disk of the sun. Aten had long been worshipped as one aspect of the divine world, but never as its sole focus. The great temples remained dedicated to gods such as Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and countless local deities whose worship stretched back for centuries. Amenhotep IV believed Aten deserved something more. Exactly why remains one of ancient history's greatest mysteries. Some historians argue that his reforms reflected genuine religious conviction. Others believe they were also political, weakening the powerful priesthood of Amun, whose immense wealth and influence had begun to rival that of the pharaoh himself. Whatever his motives, the consequences were extraordinary. Around his 5th year as king, Amenhotep IV changed his own name. He became Akhenaten. The new name meant something like effective for Aten, publicly declaring his devotion to the sun disk. It was more than a personal statement. It marked the beginning of a revolution. Across Egypt, traditional temples lost royal support. The names and images of Amun were systematically removed from monuments. State-sponsored worship shifted almost entirely toward Aten, who was represented not as a human or animal, but as a radiant sun disk, whose rays ended in tiny hands, extending the gift of life toward the royal family. Then Akhenaten made an even more astonishing decision. He abandoned Egypt's traditional centers of power altogether. Instead of ruling from Thebes or Memphis, he ordered the construction of an entirely new capital in the desert, halfway between the two. The city was called Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten. Today it is known simply as Amarna. Built with remarkable speed, the city featured broad avenues, open-air temples, royal palaces, workshops, administrative buildings, and homes for thousands of officials and craftsmen. Unlike the dark sanctuaries of earlier Egyptian temples, Aten's shrines were designed without roofs, allowing sunlight to pour directly onto their altars. Everything centered on the sun. Akhenaten himself became the chief intermediary between Aten and humanity. In effect, access to the divine increasingly flowed through the king and his family, rather than through the traditional priesthood. Standing beside him throughout this transformation was one of the most recognizable women of the ancient world, Nefertiti. Her famous painted limestone bust, discovered in 1912, has become an icon of ancient Egypt. Yet the sculpture represents only a fraction of her historical significance. Nefertiti appeared beside Akhenaten in temple reliefs, performing rituals once reserved almost exclusively for kings. In some scenes, she is shown striking enemies or making offerings directly to Aten, suggesting she held an unusually prominent role within the new religious system. Some scholars have even proposed that she briefly ruled after Akhenaten's death, though the evidence remains debated. The artistic style of the Amarna period changed as dramatically as its religion. For centuries, Egyptian art had followed strict conventions. Kings appeared youthful, powerful, and eternally perfect. Figures stood in formal poses, emphasizing timeless stability rather than individual personality. Under Akhenaten, those rules seemed to dissolve. Royal sculptures portrayed elongated skulls, narrow faces, rounded stomachs, wide hips, and intimate family scenes, unlike anything seen before in Egyptian art. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were shown embracing their daughters beneath Aten's rays, creating images that felt surprisingly personal and almost domestic. Historians continue to debate what these unusual depictions mean. Some once suggested Akhenaten suffered from a medical condition, but modern scholars generally reject that idea. More likely, the artistic changes reflected a deliberate effort to distinguish the new religious order from everything that had come before. Yet while the king transformed religion and art, the empire itself demanded attention. Letters discovered at Amarna revealed desperate appeals from Egypt's governors in Syria and Canaan. Local rulers pleaded for military assistance as rival kingdoms expanded their influence, and loyal allies came under attack. Again and again, they asked for soldiers. Again and again, the responses appear to have been insufficient. Whether Akhenaten simply cared less about foreign affairs or believed diplomacy could preserve Egypt's influence remains uncertain. What is clear is that the empire his ancestors had built began to weaken as competing powers, particularly the Hittite Empire, took advantage of Egypt's reduced involvement. After roughly 17 years on the throne, Akhenaten disappeared from history. The circumstances of his death remain uncertain, and the years that followed are among the most confusing in Egyptian chronology. A handful of short-lived rulers may have governed briefly before the throne passed to a boy no more than 9 years old. His name was Tutankhaten. Within a few years, it became Tutankhamun. The name change told the entire story. The young king abandoned Akhenaten's religious revolution, restoring the worship of Amun and the traditional gods. The royal court left Amarna, returning to the historic centers of Egyptian government. Temples reopened, old rituals resumed, and officials worked quickly to erase much of Akhenaten's legacy from public memory. Later kings went even further. Akhenaten's monuments were dismantled. His name was omitted from many king lists. Statues were broken apart, and building stones from his city were reused in new construction. To later generations of Egyptians, he was not remembered as a visionary. He was remembered as a heretic. Ironically, the ruler who became one of the most famous pharaohs in modern history was not Akhenaten, but his young successor. Tutankhamun ruled for less than a decade and accomplished relatively little politically. He died around the age of 18, leaving behind no surviving heir and only a modest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Had grave robbers found it in antiquity, he might have remained an obscure footnote. Instead, in 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the only nearly intact royal tomb ever discovered in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Hidden beneath layers of debris for more than 3,000 years, it contained over 5,000 objects: golden shrines, chariots, jewelry, furniture, weapons, clothing, and the now famous solid gold funerary mask that has become one of the world's most recognizable archaeological treasures. Tutankhamun's tomb transformed modern understanding of ancient Egypt. It offered an unprecedented glimpse into the wealth, artistry, and craftsmanship of the new kingdom, while reminding the world that even a relatively minor king could be buried with astonishing splendor. Yet the restoration of the old gods did not fully restore Egypt's former dominance. To the north, the Hittites continued expanding their influence. New rivals challenged Egyptian authority across the Near East, and the empire required a ruler capable of defending what remained. That ruler would become one of the most celebrated pharaohs in history. His monuments would tower above the Nile. His likeness would be carved into mountainsides, and his name would outlive almost every other king of ancient Egypt. Ramesses II ascended the throne around 1279 BC. Egypt was still one of the great powers of the ancient world, but the balance of power had changed. To the north, the Hittite Empire had grown into a formidable rival, controlling much of Anatolia and northern Syria. The smaller kingdoms that lay between the two empires had become a political chessboard, their rulers shifting loyalties whenever circumstances changed. Whoever controlled these territories controlled the trade routes linking Egypt to the riches of Asia. Ramesses intended to reclaim them. Unlike Akhenaten, whose attention had been fixed on religious reform, Ramesses embraced the image of the warrior king. From the beginning of his reign, he launched campaigns into Canaan and Syria, determined to restore Egypt's influence over lands that had gradually slipped from its grasp. Those ambitions culminated in one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, Kadesh. Around 1274 BC, Ramesses marched north with an army divided into 4 large divisions, each named after one of Egypt's principal gods. His objective was the fortified city of Kadesh, strategically positioned near the Orontes River in modern-day Syria. Waiting for him was the Hittite king Muwatalli II. The Hittites had assembled one of the largest armies of the Bronze Age, including thousands of chariots and soldiers drawn from across their vast empire. Both kingdoms understood that the outcome at Kadesh would shape the future of the Near East. As Ramesses approached the city, he received encouraging news. Captured scouts claimed the Hittite army was still far to the north. The information was false. Whether the scouts had deliberately misled the Egyptians or were forced to do so under interrogation remains unclear, but the effect was devastating. Believing the enemy was distant, Ramesses advanced ahead of the rest of his army. His divisions became dangerously separated. The Hittites struck. Hundreds of heavy chariots crashed into the unsuspecting Egyptian camp, throwing the advancing army into chaos. Soldiers scattered. Officers struggled to organize a defense. For a brief moment, it appeared that Egypt's greatest king might suffer a catastrophic defeat. According to the inscriptions Ramesses later commissioned, he found himself nearly alone, abandoned by his troops as he charged fearlessly into the enemy ranks with the protection of the god Amun. The reality was probably less dramatic. Modern historians generally agree that Ramesses showed considerable courage during the crisis, but they also recognize the royal inscriptions as carefully crafted propaganda. Reinforcements arrived at a critical moment, likely including troops who had marched rapidly to support the king. Together, they stabilized the battlefield and prevented the Hittites from destroying the Egyptian army. By the end of the day, neither side had achieved a decisive victory. Ramesses returned to Egypt, proclaiming a glorious triumph. Hittite records likewise celebrated their own success. In truth, Kadesh ended in something closer to a strategic stalemate. Neither empire gained lasting control of the contested region. Yet the battle changed history in another way. Years later, Egypt and the Hittite Empire negotiated what is generally regarded as the world's oldest surviving international peace treaty. Copies of the agreement survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. The treaty pledged mutual assistance, established peaceful relations between the two powers, and even included provisions for extraditing political fugitives. Eventually, the peace was strengthened further through a royal marriage between Ramesses and a Hittite princess. Diplomacy had accomplished what decades of warfare could not. Freed from constant conflict in the north, Ramesses turned his attention towards something future generations would remember even more vividly: building. If the pyramid builders had transformed Egypt's skyline, Ramesses covered the kingdom with monuments bearing his name. He expanded the great temples at Karnak and Luxor. He founded a new royal capital in the eastern delta called Ramesses, filled with palaces, gardens, workshops, and military installations. Across Egypt and Nubia, colossal statues of the king appeared at temples, gateways, and public squares. No pharaoh understood the power of architecture better. Every monument proclaimed the same message: Ramesses ruled with the favor of the gods, and his reign represented the natural order of the world. His greatest masterpiece rose far to the south. At Abu Simbel, engineers carved an entire temple directly into a sandstone cliff overlooking the Nile. 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses, each standing over 60 feet tall, guarded the entrance. Inside, richly decorated chambers celebrated the king's victories and honored the gods. The temple also demonstrated astonishing astronomical precision. Twice each year, sunlight penetrates deep into the sanctuary, illuminating statues of the gods and the deified Ramesses, while leaving the figure of Ptah, the god associated with the underworld, in shadow. Whether every aspect of this alignment was intentional continues to be studied, but the effect remains one of the ancient world's most remarkable architectural achievements. In the 1960s, the temples faced destruction as Egypt constructed the Aswan High Dam. Rather than allowing Abu Simbel to disappear beneath the rising waters of Lake Nasser, an international effort led by UNESCO carefully cut the entire complex into massive blocks and reassembled it on higher ground. It remains one of the largest archaeological preservation projects ever undertaken. Ramesses himself seemed almost larger than life. He ruled for approximately 66 years, outliving many of his wives, children, generals, and even several of the sons expected to inherit his throne. By the time he died around 1213 BC, generations of Egyptians had known no other king. His family was enormous. Ancient inscriptions record more than 100 children, though the exact number remains uncertain. Among his many queens, Nefertari held a special place. Ramesses honored her with a magnificent tomb in the Valley of the Queens and dedicated a smaller temple beside his own at Abu Simbel. an extraordinary gesture in a society where royal monuments overwhelmingly celebrated the king alone. For much of his reign, Egypt appeared stronger than ever. Its monuments were unmatched. Its diplomacy commanded respect. Its borders remained secure, and its economy continued to benefit from agriculture, trade, and the wealth accumulated over generations of empire. Yet beneath the surface, the ancient world was changing. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms that had flourished for centuries were beginning to experience growing instability. Trade networks became increasingly fragile. Powerful states found themselves under mounting pressure from internal unrest, climate fluctuations, and waves of migration. Within only a few decades of Ramesses' death, many of the great civilizations of the Bronze Age would collapse. Egypt would survive, but it would never again dominate the ancient world as it had under the great kings of the New Kingdom. The Age of Empire was drawing to a close, and a long struggle for survival was about to begin. When Ramesses II died around 1213 BC, he left behind a kingdom that seemed as magnificent as ever. His temples towered above the Nile. His statues dominated the landscape from the Delta to Nubia. His name had become synonymous with royal power itself. To later generations, his reign would represent the last great flowering of Egypt's empire. But monuments can hide weakness. The prosperity of the new kingdom depended upon a delicate balance of trade, stable harvests, loyal provinces, and secure borders. During the decades after Ramesses' death, that balance began to unravel, not only in Egypt, but across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Historians call this period the Bronze Age collapse. Around the end of the 13th century BC, many of the great civilizations that had dominated the region for centuries experienced sudden decline. The mighty Hittite Empire disappeared entirely. Palaces in Mycenaean Greece were abandoned or destroyed. Cities across the Levant burned, while long-distance trade networks that had connected kingdoms for generations broke apart. Exactly why this happened remains one of archaeology's greatest debates. Rather than a single catastrophe, modern scholars believe the collapse resulted from several crises occurring at once. Evidence points to prolonged droughts in some regions, crop failures, earthquakes, political instability, internal rebellions, and the breakdown of international trade. Kingdoms that had become deeply interconnected suddenly found themselves unable to support the complex systems upon which they depended. Into this chaos came mysterious raiders known today as the Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions describe groups arriving both by land and sea, bringing entire families with them in ox-drawn carts while heavily armed warriors attacked coastal settlements. Their exact origins remain uncertain. They may have come from the Aegean, Anatolia, the Central Mediterranean, or several regions at once. Rather than a single nation, they were likely a loose collection of displaced peoples moving through a collapsing world. One pharaoh would confront them directly. Ramesses III. Ascending the throne around 1184 BC, Ramesses III inherited a kingdom facing challenges unlike any Egypt had encountered before. The empire's northern possessions had become increasingly difficult to defend. Neighboring kingdoms had fallen, and waves of migrants pressed toward Egypt's borders. In his 8th regnal year, the crisis reached its peak. The Sea Peoples advanced into Egypt itself. Reliefs carved into the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu provide one of the most detailed visual records of any ancient battle. They depict fierce fighting on both land and water. Egyptian archers filled the sky with arrows while enemy ships became tangled in carefully prepared defensive formations. On shore, infantry and chariots confronted advancing warriors in desperate combat. Ramesses claimed a decisive victory. While royal inscriptions naturally exaggerate the king's achievements, most historians agree that Egypt successfully repelled the invasion. Unlike the Hittites and several other Bronze Age powers, Egypt survived. But survival came at a cost. The empire that emerged after Ramesses III was no longer the confident superpower of Thutmose III or Ramesses II. Many foreign territories were abandoned. International trade shrank dramatically. The royal treasury struggled to support the enormous bureaucracy, army, and temple system that previous generations had built. The strain soon became visible at home. One remarkable document records what is believed to be the first labor strike in recorded history. At the royal village of Deir el-Medina, where skilled craftsmen carved and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, workers stopped building after their grain rations failed to arrive on time. Instead of continuing their work, they marched to nearby temples and demanded payment. Their protests succeeded. The surviving papyrus preserves not only their complaints, but also the government's attempts to resolve the crisis. It offers an unusually human glimpse into a civilization often remembered only through its kings and monuments. Even the artisans responsible for Egypt's greatest treasures struggled when the state's finances faltered. Meanwhile, another institution continued growing stronger: the priesthood of Amun. Over centuries, Egypt's temples had accumulated enormous wealth through royal donations, agricultural estates, and tribute from conquered lands. By the end of the New Kingdom, the high priests of Amun controlled vast resources and commanded influence rivaling that of the pharaoh himself. Political power once again became divided. Around 1070 BC, Egypt effectively split into separate spheres of authority. Kings ruled from the north, while the high priests governed much of Upper Egypt from Thebes. Although both claimed to uphold Ma'at, the unified kingdom created by Narmer had fractured once more. The centuries that followed saw a succession of new dynasties. Some rulers were descendants of Libyan military families who had settled in Egypt generations earlier. Rather than destroying Egyptian traditions, they embraced them completely, adopting Egyptian names, participating in religious ceremonies, and presenting themselves as legitimate pharaohs. Later came another remarkable dynasty. From the south, in the Kingdom of Kush, centered in modern-day Sudan, a line of Nubian rulers expanded northward along the Nile. Around 728 BC, King Pai conquered Egypt. To many Egyptians, these Kushite rulers were not foreign occupiers, but restorers of ancient traditions. Fascinated by Egypt's glorious past, they revived older artistic styles, rebuilt neglected temples, and emphasized religious devotion reminiscent of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Their rule became known as Egypt's 25th dynasty. Yet even these ambitious kings faced an opponent unlike any before. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was expanding with astonishing speed. The Assyrians had forged one of history's most formidable military machines. Professional armies equipped with iron weapons, powerful siege engines, and disciplined infantry conquered kingdom after kingdom across the Near East. Eventually, Egypt became their target. In 671 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded the Nile Valley, capturing Memphis and forcing the Kushite ruler Taharqa to retreat south. Although Egyptian resistance continued for years, another Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, launched further campaigns that effectively ended Kushite control over Egypt. For the first time, the Nile Valley had fallen to a vast imperial power from Mesopotamia. The Assyrians themselves did not remain for long. As their empire collapsed, a new Egyptian dynasty emerged from the city of Sais in the western delta. These rulers briefly restored a measure of independence, encouraging trade with the Greek world and rebuilding parts of the kingdom. It was a final renaissance, but one overshadowed by the rise of an even greater empire to the east. The Persians. In 525 BC, King Cambyses II invaded Egypt after defeating its army at the Battle of Pelusium. Ancient writers later filled the story with dramatic tales, including the claim that Persian soldiers used sacred animals as shields to discourage Egyptian attacks. But modern historians treat these accounts with considerable skepticism. What is certain is that the Persian victory brought Egypt into the largest empire the world had yet seen. The pharaoh was replaced by a Persian great king. Although periods of rebellion briefly restored native rule, Persian authority repeatedly returned. Egypt remained wealthy and strategically valuable, supplying grain, taxes, and manpower to an empire stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. After nearly 3,000 years, Egypt was no longer the master of its own destiny. Although periods of rebellion briefly restored native rule, Persian authority repeatedly returned. Egypt remained wealthy and strategically valuable, supplying grain, taxes, and manpower to an empire stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. After nearly 3,000 years, Egypt was no longer the master of its own destiny. The age of native pharaohs was drawing to a close. Then, in 332 BC, a young Macedonian king crossed into Egypt without facing significant resistance. Unlike previous conquerors, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. Before leaving the country, he founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would become one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. His name was Alexander, and although he would never return to Egypt again, the dynasty established by his successors would produce the last pharaoh in history, a queen named Cleopatra. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BC, he did not arrive as a conqueror in the eyes of many Egyptians. For nearly 2 centuries, the country had endured repeated periods of Persian rule. Although the Persians had respected many Egyptian traditions, they remained foreign rulers governing one of the richest lands in their empire. Alexander's swift victories over Persia transformed him into something entirely different. To many Egyptians, he appeared as a liberator. The priests welcomed him. At Memphis, Alexander participated in traditional ceremonies honoring the ancient gods, presenting himself as the rightful successor to the pharaohs who had ruled the Nile for thousands of years. He understood an important lesson that many conquerors had overlooked. Egypt could not simply be occupied. It had to be embraced. Soon afterward, he traveled west across the desert to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis. Exactly what was said inside the sanctuary remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Ancient writers offer different accounts, but many claim the priests recognized Alexander as the son of Amun, reinforcing his belief that he possessed a divine destiny. Whether fact or legend, the story became an important part of his growing reputation. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander made one decision that would shape the country's future more than any military victory. On a narrow strip of Mediterranean coastline between the sea and Lake Mareotis, he founded a new city, Alexandria. Its location was carefully chosen. Unlike many ancient Egyptian cities that faced inward toward the Nile, Alexandria opened directly onto the Mediterranean. It linked Egypt to the Greek world, becoming both a commercial crossroads and a gateway between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Alexander never saw the city completed. In 323 BC, while campaigning in Babylon, he died unexpectedly at just 32 years old. His vast empire fragmented almost immediately as his generals fought over its territories. Egypt fell to one of those generals, Ptolemy. Rather than returning Alexander's body to Macedonia for burial, Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession and brought it to Egypt, where Alexander was eventually entombed in Alexandria. Possessing the body of the conqueror carried immense symbolic power. It helped legitimize Ptolemy's own rule as he established a dynasty that would govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian. They spoke Greek at court, governed through Greek institutions, and encouraged immigration from across the Hellenistic world. Yet they also adopted the ancient title of pharaoh, funded Egyptian temples, and appeared in traditional religious ceremonies. Their kingdom became an extraordinary blend of 2 civilizations. Nowhere was that fusion more visible than Alexandria. Within only a few generations, it had grown into one of the largest cities on Earth. Merchants crowded its harbors with ships carrying grain, papyrus, wine, spices, ivory, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Wide avenues, palaces, theaters, and marketplaces reflected Greek urban planning, while Egyptian traditions continued to thrive throughout the countryside. The city also became the intellectual heart of the ancient world. Its famous library sought to collect every book that could be found. Scholars copied manuscripts arriving aboard foreign ships before returning the originals to their owners. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and literature flourished within its halls. Among the scholars who worked there was Euclid, whose writings on geometry shaped mathematics for more than 2,000 years. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using little more than careful observation and mathematics. Physicians studied anatomy, while poets and philosophers transformed Alexandria into a center of learning, unlike anything the world had seen before. Standing watch over the harbor was another marvel, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Built on the island of Pharaohs, the massive tower rose well over 300 feet into the sky, making it one of the tallest structures of the ancient world. By day, polished surfaces reflected sunlight across the sea. By night, fires burning at its summit guided ships safely toward the harbor. Together with the Great Pyramid and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, it became celebrated as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Yet beneath this remarkable prosperity, the Ptolemaic dynasty was rarely peaceful. Royal marriages between brothers and sisters, intended to preserve the family's claim to power, produced endless rivalries. Assassinations, civil wars, and palace conspiracies became almost routine. Roman influence grew steadily as ambitious rulers sought support from the increasingly powerful republic across the Mediterranean. By the 1st century BC, Egypt remained fabulously wealthy, but it was no longer the dominant power of earlier ages. Rome was. Into this dangerous world was born Cleopatra VII. She was the final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty and, in many ways, unlike her predecessors. While earlier Ptolemies often remained culturally Greek, Cleopatra embraced both sides of her kingdom. Ancient sources report that she learned the Egyptian language in addition to Greek and several others, making her one of the few members of her dynasty able to speak directly with her Egyptian subjects without an interpreter. She inherited a kingdom burdened by debt, political intrigue, and Roman interference. When her father died in 51 BC, Cleopatra became co-ruler with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. The arrangement quickly collapsed into civil war. Forced to flee Alexandria, Cleopatra searched for an ally powerful enough to restore her throne. That ally arrived in pursuit of another enemy, Julius Caesar. Having defeated Pompey during Rome's civil war, Caesar followed his rival to Egypt, only to discover that Pompey had already been murdered by advisors hoping to win Roman favor. Instead, the killing outraged Caesar, who soon found himself drawn into Egypt's internal conflict. According to later tradition, Cleopatra arranged to be secretly brought into Caesar's presence, concealed within a rolled carpet or a large linen sack. Whether every detail of the story is true remains uncertain, but its outcome is not. Caesar backed Cleopatra. After months of fighting in Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII drowned while attempting to escape across the Nile, and Cleopatra regained her throne. Their alliance soon produced a son known as Caesarion. For a time, it appeared that Egypt's future might be secured. Then, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome. His death plunged the Roman Republic into yet another civil war. Among the leaders competing for power was Mark Antony. An experienced general and close ally of Caesar, Antony eventually met Cleopatra in the city of Tarsus. Ancient writers describe her arrival with unmistakable theatricality. A magnificent barge with purple sails drifted along the river while musicians played and servants burned exotic incense. Whether embellished or not, the meeting proved decisive. Their political alliance soon became a personal one. Together, they had 3 children, and Antony increasingly relied upon Egypt's enormous wealth to support his campaigns. In Rome, however, his growing relationship with Cleopatra became a powerful weapon for his rival. Octavian, the adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar, portrayed Antony as a Roman who had abandoned his country for an Eastern queen. Through speeches, propaganda, and careful political maneuvering, Octavian convinced many Romans that the conflict was no longer merely another civil war. It was a struggle for Rome's future. The decisive confrontation came in 31 BC. At the Battle of Actium, off the western coast of Greece, the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's forces. The battle unfolded over hours beneath the summer sun. As the fighting intensified, Cleopatra's ships broke through the blockade and sailed for Egypt. Antony followed. Their remaining fleet surrendered soon afterward. The war was over. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Believing Cleopatra dead, Antony took his own life. Mortally wounded, he was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had taken refuge, dying in her arms exactly as later generations would remember. Days later, Cleopatra herself chose death rather than humiliation in a Roman triumph. Whether by the bite of an asp, a concealed poison, or another method, historians cannot say with certainty. What they can say is this: with Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, the line of the Pharaohs ended forever. Octavian annexed Egypt as a Roman province, securing its immense wealth and grain supply for the empire he would soon rule as Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The civilization that had begun with scattered villages along the Nile more than 3,000 years earlier had reached its final chapter. But Egypt itself was far from finished. Its temples still stood. Its language was still spoken. Its monuments continued to astonish visitors from across the ancient world. Even under Roman rule, the legacy of the pharaohs refused to disappear. It would survive for centuries more, before gradually falling silent, only to be rediscovered by the modern world.